Romans chapter 1, verse 15. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. In Romans 1:16, Paul mentions the gospel of Christ. You recall that in Romans 1, verse 1, he talked about the gospel of God. I want to show you something about the gospel of Christ. Get 1 Corinthians 9, verse 17. For if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:17 that a specific dispensation of the gospel was committed unto him. It's very similar to what he says in Ephesians 3:2, where he talks about the dispensation of the grace of God that was given to him. Look with me at verse 18. What is my reward then? Verily that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. So in verse 17, what he calls the dispensation of the gospel, the specific gospel that was committed unto him that was not committed unto Peter, it is, in verse 18, the gospel of Christ. The gospel of Christ is the particular gospel given to Paul that was not given to Peter and the 12. Now go back with me to Romans 1:16, and let's sort of dig into this a little bit. Paul says in verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. And then notice this, for it is the power of God unto salvation. What saves someone today is the gospel of Christ. It's not a particular Bible version or something like that. What happens is someone gets saved when they hear the gospel of Christ and they believe it. Now notice what he says here. For it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. Then he says, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Let's talk for a minute about to the Jew first. Sometimes people are bothered by where it says to the Jew first, because Paul, of course, is the apostle of the Gentiles. We know that from Romans 11:13. So why does it say here to the Jew first if he's the apostle of the Gentiles? Get with me Acts chapter 17, and we'll look at verse 1. Acts chapter 17, and we'll look at verse 1. Acts 17, verse 1. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. So Paul's obviously in Thessalonica, and there's a synagogue present. Verse 2, and Paul, as his manner was, so he didn't just do this on this one occasion, this was his regular practice. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. What we see in Acts 17 is when Paul goes into a city, what is the very first thing he does? He goes to the synagogue. Very much like Romans 1:16 says, to the Jew first. Well, why does someone who is called the apostle of the Gentiles go to the Jew first? Why would he do that? I'm going to suggest to you it's for the following reason. If you think about the chart and you think about how things had been for, say, the last 2,000 years or so, who was God's chosen people? Israel, right? And when you think about Ephesians 2, 11 through 13, it tells you that in time past, what was the condition of Gentiles? They were without hope. They were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and because they were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, they were strangers from the covenants of promise. Now, Paul is the apostle of the Gentiles, but doesn't God have some obligation to the Jews? I mean, the dispensation of grace fundamentally changes things, doesn't it? In time past, the Jews were God's chosen people. The Gentiles were without hope. When you think of the dispensation of grace, what happens? Well, is there a difference today between Jew and Gentile? There's not, according to Galatians 3:28, Romans 10, verse 12. Doesn't God have an obligation to tell the Jews that something has changed? He does. And the reason why Paul goes in the synagogue first is he's going to the Jews to let them know Jehovah God, the God of Israel, the God that we worship, has changed what he's doing today. There is no longer a middle wall of partition between Jew and Gentile. Yes, there was. It was in place for 2,000 years, but you need to understand that's no longer what's happening. Well, basic decency requires Paul to go to the Jews first to tell them that. Look with me at Galatians 2, verse 7. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 7. Galatians 2:7. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. For he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. What Galatians 2, verses 7 through 9 clearly describes is Peter and Paul have different gospels. Paul has the gospel of the uncircumcision. Peter has the gospel of the circumcision. What the verses then tell you is Paul was going to go to the uncircumcised and Peter was going to go to the circumcised. So people sometimes say, well, okay, wait a minute then. If there was an agreement in Acts 15, recorded in Acts 2, where Peter says, I'm going to go to the circumcision and you're going to go to the uncircumcision, was Paul cheating in Acts 17? Was he going to, when he went into the synagogue, was he violating that agreement? Now, I'm going to suggest to you I don't think he was. And here's why. So think through this with me for a minute. If Paul goes into a city and a Jew comes up to him and says, I want to be saved, should Paul say to him, you know what? I'm actually sent to someone else. So if you could just wait for a couple years, Peter and the guys will be around and they'll come see you then. And try not to die before they get here, but just be patient and someone that can actually speak to you will eventually arrive. Does that make any sense whatsoever? Now let me give you something else here. You ready? If you're a sales manager and you have to divide up your territories, okay? Do you divide the territory where you give someone the north section and the south section, or do you divide it up in a way where you say, okay, you get the odd numbered addresses and you get the even numbered addresses? Would it be completely impractical to give your salesman and say, okay, look, you handle the odd addresses, 22, 32, 42, and you handle 21, 31, 41. Would that make any sense? You would force everyone to cover the entire territory if you did that, right? Everyone would have to cover every street. It would be totally illogical. What you would do is you would adopt a simple geographic division. You go to this area, and I'll go to this area. Now look with me at Romans 15. verse 19. Romans 15, verse 19. Through mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about Illyricum I have fully preached the gospel of Christ. That's a geographic reference, isn't it? He's talking about the physical area in which he preached. Verse 20, yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not, what's the next word? Where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. See, what all those verses tell you is that when Peter and Paul reach their agreement, the division is one of geography. Paul didn't preach Christ where, that's the word that's used there in verse 20, where Peter already had. Paul went to a different location. That's why he goes on the missionary journeys he goes on. When Paul goes on those missionary journeys, does he say to all the synagogues and all the Jews that are there, because the Jews were scattered among the nations, just wait, guys. Peter will eventually be here someday, maybe. No, it's not what he says. He goes into the synagogue first with the gospel of Christ to the Jew first, and tells them the information that they need. And after that, he goes to the Gentiles.